The snow fell in thick, silent sheets beyond the towering glass wall of James Carver's Manhattan penthouse, blanketing the city in a shroud of white. From the 57th floor, the world below looked like a distant dream. Streetlights flickering, through the haze like lost stars, Christmas decorations blinking faintly along Fifth Avenue. Inside, the air was warm, tinged with the sharp scent of whiskey and the soft hum of a jazz record spinning in the corner. James stood by the window, a crystal tumbler in one hand, the other buried in the pocket of his tailored vest. His fingers brushed against something small, cold, and familiar, a silver wedding band, worn smooth by time. For 30 years, it had lived there, a secret he couldn't explain, even to himself. At 62, James Carver was a man carved from discipline and ambition, a Wall Street titan, CEO of Carver Enterprises, a name synonymous with power. His gray hair was impeccably swept back, his face a map of hard-earned lines, but his eyes, sharp and blue, betrayed a restlessness he'd spent decades burying. Success had built this life, the penthouse with its sleek black furniture, the view that screamed wealth, but it hadn't filled the quiet spaces. Tonight those spaces felt louder than ever. He took a slow sip of whiskey, the burn grounding him, and glanced at the desk where his laptop glowed with a new email. The subject line was blank, but the words inside hit like a fist. "Do you still have the ring? I'm waiting in Maine." The handwriting, digitized yet unmistakable, was hers. Maggie's. Soft, slanted letters, the kind that once scribbled love notes on napkins. His breath caught, a flicker of memory slicing through the years. Atlantic City, 1995, the neon glow of a casino, her laughter as they stumbled into a chapel, drunk on cheap wine and reckless abandon. They'd married under a flickering sign, her in a borrowed dress, him slipping that silver band onto her finger with a grin he hadn't worn since. He'd left her the next morning. No note, no goodbye, just the echo of her voice calling his name as he shut the hotel door. He'd told himself it was necessary. His father, a cold, towering figure in finance, had drilled it into him. No liabilities, James. You want the top, you travel light. Maggie, sweet, unpolished Maggie, was a liability. She didn't fit the Carver mold, didn't belong in the world of boardrooms and black-tie galas. So he'd walked away, chasing a legacy that demanded everything. He'd won it too. But now, staring at that email, the victory tasted like ash. His hand tightened around the glass. I made the right choice, he thought, the mantra of a lifetime. But the lie felt thin tonight, stretched taut by the memory of her eyes, brown, warm, pleading, when he'd turned his back. He pulled the ring from his pocket, setting it on the polished wood of the coffee table. The light caught the faint engraving inside. M&J. Maggie and James, a promise he'd broken before the ink dried. He stared at it, the silver glinting like an accusation. Why had he kept it? A trophy of his escape, or a tether to something he couldn't name? The city buzzed below, oblivious, to the storm brewing in his chest. He was James Carver, untouchable, unshakable. Yet here he was, undone by a few words on a screen. Maine. What was she doing there? Why now, after 30 years of silence? He drained the whiskey, the heat searing his throat, and paced to the window. The snow blurred the lights into a golden haze, a mirror to the fog in his mind. He could delete the email, pretend it never came. That's what the old James would do, bury it, move on. But his fingers lingered over the ring, tracing its curve. He saw her again, unbidden. Maggie under the casino lights, her hair a wild cascade, her smile cutting through the chaos. She'd looked at him like he was enough, just James, not the heir, not the mogul. For one night he'd believed it. Then dawn broke, and with it, the weight of his father's voice. You'll fail if you let her stay. Fear had won. Ambition had won. He'd chosen the penthouse over her, the boardroom over that fleeting warmth. And he'd never looked back until now. The record skipped, a scratch pulling him from the past. He crossed the room, lifting the needle with a trembling hand. Silence fell, heavy as the snow. He returned to the table, the ring staring up at him like an eye. "I'm waiting in Maine." What did she want? Money? Revenge? Or something he couldn't give? His chest tightened, a pang he refused to call guilt. He was too old for regrets, too hardened for apologies. Yet the question gnawed. What if I'd stayed? He picked up the ring, rolling it between his fingers. It was light, cheap, a trinket from a night he'd dismissed as a mistake. But it carried weight now, decades of unspoken things. He slipped it back into his pocket, the cold metal pressing against his palm. The laptop chimed again, a reminder of the email still open. He didn't move to close it. Instead, he poured another whiskey, the amber liquid catching the light. "It's too late," he muttered, his voice low, rough with something he wouldn't name. But his hand stayed in his pocket, clutching the ring like a lifeline. Outside, the snow thickened, swallowing the city in white. The Christmas lights blinked on, relentless in their cheer. James stood there, a silhouette against the glass. A man who'd built an empire but lost something he couldn't reclaim. The ring burned in his grip, a whisper from a life he'd left behind. And for the first time in 30 years, he wondered if it was truly too late to listen. The engine of James Carver's black Bentley purred through the snow-dusted streets of Manhattan, the city's pulse muffled under a blanket of white. He gripped the wheel, his knuckles pale against the leather, as the golden glow of streetlight streaked across the windshield. The whiskey still lingered on his tongue, sharp and bitter, but it couldn't drown the echo of Maggie's words. "Do you still have the ring?" The email had cracked something open, and now the past spilled out, unbidden, like blood from an old wound. He didn't need to close his eyes to see her. Atlantic City, 1995, a night carved in neon and reckless joy. The casino lights had pulsed. Around them, a kaleidoscope of red and gold as Maggie laughed, her voice cutting through the clatter of slot machines. She'd worn a borrowed dress, white, too big, slipping off one shoulder, and her hair fell in wild waves, framing a face that glowed with something he couldn't name. They'd met at the bar, two strangers sharing cheap wine, until a dare turned into a vow. The chapel was a blur, a flickering sign, a sleepy officiant, and that silver ring, $5 from a pawn shop, sliding onto her finger. She'd looked at him, eyes bright with mischief, and said, "You're stuck with me now, James Carver." He'd laughed, kissed her, believed it for a moment. The memory tightened his chest. He turned onto Park Avenue, the snow crunching under the tires, and let it play out. Morning came too fast, gray light seeping through the hotel curtains, her arm draped across his chest. He'd woken to her breathing, soft and steady, and for a heartbeat, he'd wanted to stay. But then he'd heard it. His father's voice, cold as steel. "You'll never make it with baggage. Cut her loose." Edward Carver had ruled Wall Street and his son with an iron hand, demanding perfection, legacy, a name untainted by weakness. Maggie was weakness, a girl from nowhere, no pedigree, no place in the grand plan. James had slipped out of bed, dressed in silence, and paused at the door. She'd stirred, called his name. "James?" Her voice thick with sleep and trust. He hadn't turned back. He pulled to a stop at a red light, the street empty save for a lone figure trudging through the snow. His hand slid into his pocket, fingers closing around the ring. Why had he kept it? He'd told himself it was nothing, a relic of a drunken mistake, a night erased by ambition. But that was a lie. He'd left her because he was afraid, not of her, but of failing the Carver name. His father had beaten it into him. Success is sacrifice. So he'd sacrificed her, traded her warmth for a throne atop Wall Street. And he'd won. The penthouse, the power, the headlines, all his. Yet here he was, 30 years later, driving through a city that felt more like a cage. The light turned green, but he didn't move. He pulled into a side street, parked beneath a flickering street lamp, and stepped out. The cold bit into his skin, snowflakes catching in his hair as he walked to a Starbucks glowing on the corner. Inside, the air was thick with coffee and cinnamon, a stark contrast to the sterile chill of his world. He ordered a black coffee, simple, strong, like he'd always been, and stood by the counter as the barista poured it. His hand shook, just enough to spill a drop onto his cuff, staining the crisp white shirt. He stared at it, a tiny rebellion against the perfection he'd built. Maggie would have laughed, dabbed it with a napkin, teased him for being human. He took the cup, letting it cool in his hands, and sat by the window. The street lamp outside cast a halo through the snow, and he saw her again, standing on that Atlantic City boardwalk, waves crashing behind her, the ring glinting as she held his hand. She'd asked, "What happens tomorrow?" He'd grinned, said, "We'll figure it out." But he hadn't meant it. By sunrise, he was gone, leaving her with a promise he never kept. He wondered now what she'd done. Had she waited, cried, hated him? He'd never checked, never called, never let himself care, until tonight. The coffee sat untouched, steam curling into the air. His phone buzzed in his coat, a new message from Maggie. "The girl needs you, James." The words hit like a punch. The girl, who? A daughter. His mind reeled, grasping at the impossible. Maggie had been pregnant? No, she would have told him. Wouldn't she? But he'd given her no chance. Cut her off. Buried her in the past. His breath fogged the glass as he leaned forward, staring into the night. If it was true. If there was a child, he'd lost more than a wife that day. He'd lost a life. He pulled the ring from his pocket again, holding it to the light. The engraving, M&J, stared back, a quiet indictment. He'd run from her because he feared failure, feared his father's scorn, feared a world where he wasn't in control. But control hadn't saved him from this. The hollow ache, the questions he couldn't answer. The girl needs you. What did that mean? Was Maggie dying? Was the girl in trouble? Or was this a trap, a plea for money after decades of silence? He didn't know, and that scared him more than any boardroom battle. The barista called out, "Closing in 10, snapping him back. He stood, leaving the coffee cold on the table, and stepped into the snow. The street lamp flickered above, casting shadows that danced with his own. He clutched the ring, its edges biting into his palm. 30 years ago, he'd walked away from Maggie without a word. Now she'd found him, and with her came a truth he couldn't outrun. The city loomed around him, vast and indifferent. But for the first time, James Carver felt small enough to wonder if he'd been wrong all along. He got back in the car, the engine roaring to life. The snow fell harder, a curtain closing, on the night. He didn't know where he was going, not yet. But the ring stayed in his hand, a compass pointing somewhere he'd forgotten. And as the streetlights faded behind him, he heard her voice again, soft and clear. "James?" This time he couldn't walk away. The Hamptons glittered under a thin layer of snow, the sprawling estate aglow with chandeliers and holiday cheer. James Carver stood at the center of it all, a black tuxedo framing his broad shoulders, his silver hair catching the light as he raised a glass to the crowd. The annual Carver Enterprises Gala was a spectacle. Wall Street elite, politicians, and philanthropists swirling around a ballroom dripping in crystal and evergreen. Beyond the floor-to-ceiling windows, the Atlantic churned, its waves a distant roar against the festive hum. James's voice carried over the murmurs, smooth and commanding, "To progress to legacy, may we build what lasts." The room erupted in applause, glasses clinking, a toast to his empire. He should have felt triumphant. This was his world, polished, controlled, a testament to 30 years of sacrifice. But his pocket weighed heavy with the silver ring, and Maggie's words, "The girl needs you," echoed louder than the chatter. He'd spent the drive from Manhattan wrestling with them, her second message a splinter under his skin. A daughter? Impossible. Yet the doubt gnawed, and now, under the gala's glare, it felt like a spotlight he couldn't escape. He stepped off the dais, shaking hands with a senator, nodding at a hedge fund titan, his smile a practiced mask. The jazz band struck up a lively tune, and the crowd shifted. Laughter, perfume, the rustle of silk gowns. Then a voice cut through, clear and sharp. "Mr. Carver, do you have a moment?" He turned, And there she was, a young woman in a simple, black dress, her brown eyes piercing, her stance defiant. She held a recorder, a press badge pinned to her chest. Sophie Ellis, freelance. The name hit him like a jolt, but he didn't flinch. "Of course," he said, voice cool as ice. "What's your question?" The room buzzed on, oblivious, but he felt the shift, a predator's instinct honed by decades in the game. She stepped closer, her gaze locking with his. "Tell me, Mr. Carver, do you know about the wife you left behind?" The words landed like a grenade, and the air thickened. A few heads turned, whispers rippling through the crowd. Flashbulbs popped, cameras swiveling toward them. James's smile didn't waver, but his hand tightened around the champagne flute. "I don't have time for fabricated stories," he said, his tone a blade. "If you'll excuse me, I have proof," she interrupted, holding up a folded paper. "A marriage certificate from Atlantic City, 1995. James Carver and Margaret Ellis. Ring any bells?" The room tilted. Guests murmured. Phones emerged, the hum growing into a storm. He saw it now. Her eyes, Maggie's eyes, warm and fierce, staring back at him from a face he didn't know. His chest constricted, the ring burning against his thigh. "That's enough," he snapped louder than he meant. "This is a charity event, not a tabloid circus." He turned to walk away, but her voice chased him. "She waited for you, you know. 30 years. The crowd parted, eyes wide, a sea of curiosity and judgment. He stopped, back rigid, and faced her again. "You're out of line, Miss Ellis," he said, each word clipped. "I don't know you, and I don't owe you anything." "Maybe not me," she shot back. "But what about her?" The paper trembled in her hand, her composure cracking just enough to reveal something raw, anger, pain, a daughter's grief. James's mind raced. Sophie Ellis, Maggie's last name. The pieces clicked, a brutal truth he couldn't dodge. She was his, the girl from the email, his daughter. Before he could respond, a slow clap broke the tension. Victor Lang emerged from the shadows, his silver hair slicked back, his grin sharp as a shark's. "Well, well, James," he drawled, voice dripping with malice. "Looks like the past's got a price tag after all." The room hushed, all eyes on the two titans. Victor, once James's partner, now his oldest rival, had lost millions when James cut him out of a deal decades ago. Revenge had simmered ever since, and now it gleamed in his stare. James met it head-on, his mask intact. "Careful, Victor. Digging up dirt's a messy game." Victor chuckled, stepping closer. "Oh, I'm just here to watch the show. You've got bigger problems than me tonight." He nodded at Sophie, then melted back into the crowd, leaving a trail of venom. The flashbulbs flared again, relentless. Sophie stood her ground, the certificate outstretched like a challenge. "You can run from this," she said, quieter now. "But it won't change the truth." James stared at her, his daughter, undeniable, unyielding, and felt the ground shift beneath him. The ring pressed harder, a silent scream from the past. He wanted to deny it, to walk away like he always had. But those eyes, Maggie's eyes, held him fast. "Security," he called, voice steady despite the chaos. 2 guards materialized, but he waved them off from touching her. "Escort Miss Ellis out. She's done here." They moved toward her, and she didn't resist, folding the paper with deliberate calm. "This isn't over," she said, her parting shot as they led her away. The crowd erupted, questions shouted, cameras snapping, a feeding frenzy he couldn't stop. He turned. To the window, the ocean a dark void beyond the glass. The snow fell thicker now, a curtain closing on his control. Sophie's words, "She waited for you," cut deeper than the cameras, deeper than Victor's taunts. Maggie had waited. And this girl, this stranger with his blood, had come to make him pay. His hand slipped into his pocket, fingers tracing the ring's edge. 30 years of silence had ended, and with it, the life he'd built. The band played on oblivious as whispers swirled behind him. He straightened his tie, forced a smile for the senator approaching with a handshake, but inside, the storm raged. Victor's threat loomed, Sophie's truth burned, and Maggie's shadow stretched across the miles to Maine. For the first time in decades, James Carver didn't know his next move, and as the flashbulbs popped, he wondered if the man they saw, the Titan, the legend, was already crumbling. The snowstorm roared across the Maine coast, a howling beast that battered James Carver's Bentley as he navigated the winding road to Maggie's house. The headlights cut through the whiteout, illuminating skeletal trees and the jagged edge of the sea beyond. His hands gripped the wheel, the silver ring now a cold weight in his breast pocket, pressed against his racing heart. Sophie's words from the gala, "She waited for you," had chased him here. A 3-hour drive fueled by whiskey and dread. Victor's smirk lingered too, a promise of ruin, but it was Maggie he couldn't shake. Maggie and the girl with her eyes. The house emerged from the blizzard, a weathered wooden cottage perched on a bluff, its windows glowing faintly against the dark. A garden stretched beside it, skeletal stalks of carnations bowing under the snow, a relic of something once alive. James killed the engine, the silence sudden and heavy. He stepped out, the wind slicing through his coat, and trudged to the door. His knock echoed, unanswered at first, then a shadow moved inside. The door creaked open, and there she was. Maggie Ellis, older, thinner, but unmistakably her. She stood in a faded sweater, gray hair pulled back, her face etched with lines he hadn't put there. Her brown eyes, once bright with laughter, now carried a quiet strength, shadowed by exhaustion. "James," she said, her voice a rasp, roughened by time or something worse. He couldn't speak, caught by the sight of her, real, alive, a ghost made flesh. "Maggie," he managed, the name a prayer he hadn't meant to say. She stepped aside, letting him in. The house smelled of wood smoke and salt, a far cry from his penthouse's sterile gleam. A fire crackled in the hearth, casting shadows on walls lined with books and faded photos. She gestured to a chair, but he stayed standing, the ring a silent pulse against his chest. "Why now?" he asked, sharper than he intended. "After 30 years, why this?" He pulled out his phone, showing her emails. "Do you still have the ring? And the girl needs you." Her gaze dropped and she coughed, a wet, ragged sound that made him flinch. She pressed a hand to her mouth, and when she pulled it away, a smear of blood stained her fingers. "Sit," she said, softer now. And he did, the chair creaking under him. She sank onto a worn couch, her breathing shallow. "It's not about me," she began. "It's about Sophie, our daughter." The word hit like a hammer. "Our—" He stopped, throat tight. "You mean she's—" He couldn't finish, but Maggie nodded, her eyes steady on his. "I was pregnant when you left," she said. "Didn't know it then. Found out a month later, alone in that hotel room you walked out of." Her voice held no venom, just fact, and that cut deeper. "I tried to find you, James. Wrote letters, called your office. Your secretary said you were unavailable. So I stopped." He stared at her, the room spinning. Sophie, those eyes, that fire, was his. A daughter he'd never known, born from a night he'd buried. "Why didn't you fight harder?" he asked, voice breaking. "Why didn't you make me?" "Because I loved you," she said simply, and the air left him. "I didn't want to trap you. You made your choice and I made mine, to raise her alone." He leaned forward, head in his hands, the ring digging into his chest. "I didn't know," he whispered, a plea to her, to himself. But there was more. She wasn't done. She coughed again, harder, and he looked up, seeing the truth in her pallor, her trembling hands. "There was another," she said barely. Audible. "A boy, Daniel, born a year after Sophie. He had a heart defect, lived 3 months." She paused, eyes glistening. "I held him when he went. You weren't there for that either." The words crushed him. 2 children. One lost, one grown into a stranger who hated him. He stood, pacing to the fire, the heat doing nothing for the cold inside. "Maggie, I—" He stopped, tears burning his eyes, the first in decades. I was a fool. A coward. She didn't argue, just watched him, her silence louder than any rebuke. I'm dying, James, she said at last. Lung cancer, stage 4. Months, maybe less. He turned, stunned as she went on. I don't need your money. I need you to be her father. She's angry, broken, but she's yours. He sank back into the chair, tears spilling now, hot against his cheeks. I don't deserve that, he said, voice raw. I don't deserve you. Maybe not, she agreed, a faint smile tugging her lips. But she does. Another cough racked her, and he reached out, instinct overriding shame, grasping her hand. It was frail, cold, but she squeezed back, a lifeline across the years. The door slammed open, wind howling in as Sophie stormed inside, snow clinging to her coat. Her eyes, his eyes, Maggie's eyes, blazed with fury. What the hell are you doing here? She shouted, glaring at James. You think you can waltz in after everything? Sophie, Maggie said, voice weak but firm. He's here because I asked. He's not welcome, Sophie snapped, stepping between them. You don't get to play hero now, Carver, not after you left us. She turned to Maggie, softening. You okay? Maggie nodded, but her grip on James tightened. Give him a chance, she whispered. Sophie shook her head, tears brimming, and bolted back into the storm. James rose, staring after her, then at Maggie. I'll fix this, he said. A vow, to her, to the daughter he'd failed, to the son he'd never known. But as the wind screamed outside, he wondered if some things were too broken to mend. He pulled the ring from his pocket, holding it out to Maggie. She took it, her fingers brushing his, and for a moment, they were back in that chapel, young, hopeful, whole. I'm sorry, he said, voice cracking. She closed her hand around it, and he saw forgiveness in her eyes, fragile, but real. The fire flickered, the storm raged, and James Carver, a man who'd lost everything to gain the world, stood on the edge of a truth he couldn't outrun. The hospital in coastal Maine was a squat gray building, its fluorescent lights casting a sterile glow over the linoleum floors. James Carver stood by Maggie's bedside, the rhythmic beep of a monitor slicing through the silence. She lay beneath, a thin blanket, her chest rising and falling with shallow breaths, an oxygen mask fogging over her pale face. The storm had relented outside, leaving a brittle stillness, but inside, chaos churned. James clutched the edge of her bed, his knuckles white, the silver ring now back in his pocket. A quiet weight beside his heart. 2 hours ago, he'd followed Sophie's taillights through the snow after she'd stormed out of the cottage. She'd let him hear, bursting into the ER with Maggie in her arms, coughing blood into a towel. The doctors had taken over. Tests, hushed voices, a diagnosis confirmed. Lung cancer, end stage, accelerated by pneumonia. Now Maggie rested, sedated, but fragile. While Sophie paced the hall outside, refusing to look at him, James stayed, rooted to this room, its antiseptic smell mingling with the ghosts of his failures. He pulled the ring out, rolling it between his fingers. Last night, he'd given it to her, a trembling apology, and she'd held it like a lifeline. Now it was his again, a burden he couldn't shed. I'm here, Maggie, he whispered, voice rough with unshed tears. Her hand lay limp in his, cold despite the blanket, and he traced her fingers, memorizing them. He'd lost her once to ambition. Now he was losing her to time. His phone buzzed, shattering the quiet. He fished it from his coat. Victor Lang's name on the screen. He answered, keeping his voice low. What do you want? Victor's laugh crackled through, cold and deliberate. Enjoying your family reunion, James? I've got a better one planned. Step down from Carver Enterprises. By morning, or I release proof you cooked the books in Woe 8. Tax evasion, fraud. Your empire's done. James's jaw tightened. You're bluffing. Am I? Victor's tone sharpened. I've got emails, ledgers, your signature all over them. The board's already spooked after your daughter's stunt. One push, and you're finished. The sight line went dead. James stared at the phone, then at Maggie, her breaths a fragile thread. Victor wasn't bluffing. He'd been waiting for this, a decades-old grudge, now a loaded gun. Back in '08, James had buried a shady deal to save the company, a secret Victor had sniffed out. If it hit the press, he'd lose everything. Money, reputation, the legacy his father had beaten into him. Failure is death. Edward Carver's voice echoed, a mantra James had lived by. But what was failure now? He slipped the phone away and turned to Maggie, her face peaceful despite the mask. He'd come to Maine for answers, found a daughter and a dying wife instead. Sophie's words at the gala, "She waited for you," and Maggie's confession about Daniel twisted in his gut. He'd built an empire while they suffered, alone. What was it worth if he lost them again? Footsteps broke his thoughts. Sophie entered, her coat dusted with snow, eyes red but fierce. "You're still here," she said, not a question, her voice laced with venom. "Where else would I be?" he replied, meeting her gaze. She crossed her arms, standing between him and Maggie like a shield. "Not running back to your penthouse, your precious company?" She stepped closer, voice rising. "She's dying, and you're just sitting there like it's nothing." "It's everything," he snapped, standing now, the chair scraping back. "I'm here because I owe you, more than I can ever repay." "You don't get to decide that," she shot back. "You left her bleeding in a hotel room, pregnant and alone. You don't get to play father now because she's on her last breath." Her words cut, each one a truth he couldn't dodge. "I didn't know," he said, softer, pleading. You'd have stayed?" She laughed, bitter. "Don't lie to me. You chose your life. We were just collateral." He sank back, hands trembling. "I was wrong," he said, voice breaking. "I was scared. Of failing, of my father, of everything. I thought I had to be this man he wanted. I was wrong." Sophie stared, her anger flickering, but she said nothing. She pulled a chair to Maggie's other side, taking her hand. The monitor beeped on. A fragile metronome. James reached into a bag by the bed, fruit Sophie had brought earlier, and pulled out an apple. He took a knife from his pocket, a small silver thing he carried for no reason he could name, and started peeling. His hands shook, the blade slipping, cutting uneven strips. Maggie stirred, her eyes fluttering open behind the mask. She saw him, and a faint smile curved her lips. "Been a while," she whispered, voice muffled but warm. He paused, meeting her gaze, and nodded. "Too long." He finished the apple, clumsy but earnest, and offered her a slice. She took it, her hand brushing his, a touch that steadied him. Sophie watched, silent, her walls still up but cracking. The TV flickered on in the corner, breaking news. Carver Enterprises stock plummets amid scandal rumors. James glanced at it, Victor's threat now a reality. He could go, fly back to New York, fight for his company, save the only thing he'd ever known. His father's voice roared, "Don't fail me." But Maggie's hand in his, Sophie's presence beside her, drowned it out. "I'm staying," he said to Maggie, to Sophie, to himself. He set the knife down, the apple half peeled, and leaned closer to Maggie. "I'm not leaving you again." He kissed her forehead, her skin cool against his lips, and felt her relax, a sigh escaping her. Sophie's eyes softened, just for a moment, before she looked away. The monitor beeped, steady, but faint. Outside, the snow settled, a quiet witness to a choice 30 years in the making. James Carver, CEO, titan, coward, chose his family over his empire, and in that sterile room, he found something he'd lost long ago, a reason to stay. The blizzard roared back to life outside the weathered cottage in Maine, a relentless howl that shook the windows and buried the world in white. James Carver stood in the doorway, snow clinging to his coat, his breath fogging in the dim glow of the porch light. Inside, the fire crackled, casting a warm dance of shadows across the wooden floor. Sophie sat by the hearth, her knees drawn. Up, Maggie's leather-bound journal cradled in her hands. She didn't look up as he stepped in, shutting the door against the storm. The hospital had sent them home, Maggie stable for now, resting upstairs with a nurse. But the weight of her fading life hung heavy between them. James shed his coat, the damp wool slumping over a chair, and hesitated. Sophie's silence was a wall, her anger a fortress he didn't know how to breach. He'd stayed at the hospital, chosen Maggie over his crumbling empire, but Sophie's eyes still burned with 30 years of his absence. The silver ring pressed against his chest, a quiet reminder of the vows he'd broken, and the ones he meant to keep now. He crossed the room, floorboards creaking under his weight, and stopped a few feet from her. The firelight caught her face. Sharp, cheekbones, brown eyes like Maggie's but hardened by a life he hadn't shaped. "Sophie," he said, voice low, testing the air. She didn't move, her fingers tracing the journal's spine. "What do you want?" she asked, her tone flat, cutting. "A medal for sticking around this time." He winced, but didn't retreat. "I want to talk," he said, sinking into a chair across from her. "About us. About everything." "There is no us," she snapped, finally looking up. "You don't get to claim that now. You had your chance 30 years ago." "I know," he said, hands clasping together, knuckles whitening. "I was wrong. I was scared. Scared of failing, of not being enough. My father—" He stopped, swallowing the bitterness. "He made me think love was a liability. I believed him. I shouldn't have." She stared, her gaze a blade. "So this is about you? Your excuses? You think that fixes what you did to her? To me?" "No," he said, leaning forward, voice breaking. "Nothing fixes it. I left her, left you, and I'll carry that forever. But I'm here now, Sophie. I'm not asking for forgiveness. I don't deserve it. I'm asking for a chance to be something to you." Her eyes flickered, a crack in the armor, but she turned back to the journal. "You don't know me," she muttered. "You don't know what we went through." "Then tell me," he urged, softer now. "Let me know you." She hesitated, then opened the journal, her fingers trembling as she flipped to a page near the high. "And she wrote this last year," she said, voice thick, "when the cancer got bad." She began to read, her words halting. "James, if you ever see this, know you're a good man who lost his way. I don't hate you. I never did. Sophie's strong. She's my heart. If you find her, don't let her go." James's throat tightened, tears brimming as Maggie's voice echoed through Sophie's. She waited, Sophie said, closing the book. "Every birthday, every Christmas, she'd look at the door like you'd walk in. She wrote you letters, dozens of them, never sent. I found them after she got sick." She pulled a stack from a drawer, yellowed envelopes spilling across the table. She kept hoping. I stopped. He reached for one, hands shaking, and unfolded it. Maggie's slanted script filled the page. "James, Sophie's 5 today. She asked about her dad. I said you're busy, but you love her. I hope that's true." The words gutted him, each line a year he'd missed, her first steps, her graduations, her tears. He pressed a hand to his mouth, stifling a sob. "I didn't know," he whispered. "God, I didn't know." "You didn't want to," Sophie said, but her voice softened, fraying at the edges. "She raised me alone, worked double shifts, patched my clothes, read me stories when she could barely stand. She was everything, and you were nothing," he nodded, tears falling now, hot against his cold skin. "I was a coward," he said, meeting her eyes. "I ran from her, from you, because I thought success was all that mattered. It wasn't? You were." She was. He stood, crossing to her, and knelt by the fire, his knees creaking. "I can't change the past, Sophie, but I can be here now, if you'll let me." She looked down at him, her own tears spilling, and for a moment, she was a little girl again, lost, longing. "She's dying," she said, voice cracking, "and I don't know how to do this without her." "You don't have to," he said, reaching out, tentative. "I'm not going anywhere." She didn't pull away, and he took her hands, warm from the fire, trembling in his grip. Then she broke, sobs wrenching free, and fell into him, her arms wrapping tight around his shoulders. He held her, the first embrace of a father and daughter, 30 years too late but fierce with everything he had left. The storm raged outside, wind rattling the panes, but inside, the fire held steady. He felt her shudder against him, her tears, soaking his shirt, and he whispered, "I'm sorry," over and over, a litany of regret and promise. She didn't forgive him, not yet, but she stayed, her grip a fragile bridge across the chasm he'd carved. The phone buzzed in his pocket. Victor, the board, the empire collapsing, but he ignored it. Maggie's journal lay open on the floor, her words a beacon. Don't let her go. He wouldn't. Not this time. Sophie pulled back, wiping her eyes, and he saw Maggie in her, the strength, the heart. She's upstairs, she said, voice hoarse. She'll want you there. He nodded, rising, but before he moved, his phone rang again, urgent, insistent. He glanced at it. The hospital. His stomach dropped. Sophie, he said, holding it out, and she grabbed it, answering with a trembling hand. It's Mom, she said, eyes wide, and they ran, leaving the fire to burn alone as the storm swallowed their steps. The hospital glowed under a canopy of Christmas lights, their soft twinkle clashing with the urgency that propelled James Carver and Sophie through its sliding doors. Snow swirled in their wake, the storm a fading roar as they raced down the sterile corridor. The nurse's call had been brief. Maggie had taken a turn, her lungs failing, and now every second felt like a plea. James's chest burned, the silver ring a heavy pulse in his pocket, Sophie's hand tight in his as they reached the ICU. Inside, Maggie lay still, an oxygen mask fogging with shallow breaths, her frail form dwarfed by machines. The monitors. Beep was erratic, a fragile thread unraveling. James froze at the threshold, Sophie pushing past to Maggie's side. Mom, she whispered, gripping her hand, tears streaking her face. Maggie's eyes fluttered open, finding Sophie, then James. A faint smile curved her lips and she squeezed Sophie's fingers, a silent comfort. James stepped forward, his throat raw. Maggie, he said, voice breaking. I'm here. She nodded, barely perceptible, and he took her other hand, its coldness searing him. The room shrank to this. The three of them, a family forged too late, holding on as time slipped away. Then the door swung open, and a doctor entered, clipboard in hand. She's stable for now, he said, voice clipped, but it's hours, not days. Sophie sobbed, burying her face in Maggie's shoulder, and James felt the weight of 30 years crash down. Every moment he'd missed, every chance he'd squandered. His phone buzzed, Victor Lang again, a vulture circling. He silenced it. But the threat loomed. Step down, or I ruin you. The TV in the corner flickered on, a news ticker screaming, Carver Enterprises in freefall. Fraud allegations surface. Sophie glanced up, fury flashing. Your empire's calling, she said, bitter. Go save it. No, he said, firm, meeting her eyes. I'm not leaving. She blinked, surprise softening her anger, and he turned back to Maggie, brushing a strand of gray hair from her forehead. I've run long enough. The doctor left and silence settled, broken only by the monitor's faltering rhythm. James pulled the ring from his pocket, its silver glinting under the fluorescent lights. He slid it onto Maggie's finger, his hand trembling as he closed, hers around it. I should have done this years ago, he whispered. I'm home now. Her eyes shone, a tear slipping free, and she mouthed, Thank you. Her breath a faint hiss through the mask. A commotion erupted outside, shouts, footsteps, the glare of camera flashes seeping through the glass. Sophie stood peering out. What the? She froze as Victor Lang strode into view, flanked by reporters, his silver hair gleaming under the Christmas lights strung across the lobby. He held a tablet, waving it like a trophy. Ladies and gentlemen, he boomed, voice carrying through the door. James Carver's reign ends tonight. I have proof. Tax evasion, cooked books. He's a fraud, and I'm here to bury him. The crowd surged, microphones thrusting forward, flashes blinding. James rose, his pulse pounding, and stepped into the hall, Sophie at his heels. Victor's grin widened as he spotted them. There he is, the king without a crown. Ready to confess, James. James faced him, the ring's absence a lightness on his soul. You want to fight, Victor? You've got one. He raised his voice, steady despite the chaos. I'm James Carver, and I've made mistakes. I hit a deal in RO8 to save my company, my father's legacy. I was wrong. But you, he pointed at Victor, eyes blazing. You've twisted. The truth for revenge. I've got the real ledgers and they show you took the bigger cut. Victor's smirk faltered, the crowd murmuring. Sophie stepped forward, pulling a USB drive from her coat. I've been digging, she said, loud and clear. Freelance isn't just a title. I've got evidence. Lang siphoned millions. Pinned it on him. She tossed the drive to a reporter who scrambled to catch it. Check it. Now. The room exploded. Questions, gasps, cameras swiveling to Victor. He lunged forward, snarling. You little... But security grabbed him, pinning his arms as he thrashed. This isn't over, Carver, he shouted, dragged toward the exit, his voice fading under the din. James turned away, the reporters shouting his name, but he walked back to Maggie. Sophie followed, her shoulders squared, a flicker of pride in her eyes. You didn't have to do that, he said, quiet. Yeah, I did, she replied, softer now. For her. Inside, Maggie's breathing slowed, the monitor's beep stretching, apart. James knelt by her, taking her hand with the ring, Sophie on the other side. I lost you once, he said, tears falling free. I won't lose her. Maggie's gaze shifted to Sophie, a mother's love unspoken, and back to him, forgiveness, peace. Her chest rose once more, then stilled, the monitor flatlining with a piercing wail. Sophie choked on a sob, clinging to her, and James wrapped an arm around them both, holding tight as the world dissolved. The nurse entered, silencing the machine, but he barely noticed. Maggie was gone, the ring her last tether to him, a vow kept at the end. Outside, the Christmas lights twinkled on, snow falling gentle now, a quiet shroud over the chaos. Reporters milled, Victor's shouts faded into sirens, but James stayed, Sophie's head on his shoulder, their grief a bridge across decades. She'd be proud of you, he said, voice hoarse. She'd be proud of us, Sophie corrected, her hand, finding his. They sat there, father and daughter, under the glow of a holiday they'd never share with her, but bound by a love she'd held for them both. The storm had passed, the lights enduring, and James Carver, a man who'd traded everything for nothing, found his honor in the wreckage, not in power, but in this fragile, fleeting family. The Maine coast shimmered under a rare December sun, the snow melting into patches of green along the bluff where Maggie's cottage stood. James Carver knelt in the garden, his hands buried in damp soil, planting the last of the carnation bulbs. A year had passed since that stormy Christmas Eve, since Maggie's final breath, since the hospital lights faded into grief. The air was crisp now, tinged with salt and pine, and the ocean stretched wide, a quiet witness to the life he'd rebuilt. Beside him, Sophie adjusted a wooden frame, her fingers steady as she hung a small glass case on a sturdy post. Inside it, the silver ring gleamed, its engraving, M&J, catching the light, a sentinel over the blooms. James brushed dirt from his palms, standing to survey their work. The garden had been Maggie's once, wild, neglected in her final years, but now it thrived, rows of carnations budding pink and white, a testament to her love reborn through their hands. He'd sold the penthouse, walked away from Carver Enterprises after Victor's arrest, the company dissolving under new leadership. The headlines had screamed, "Fallen Titan," but he'd let them fade, trading Wall Street's glare for this quiet shore. Sophie had stayed too, her freelance pen silenced for a while, her anger softening into something like trust. Looks good, she said, stepping back, her breath fogging in the chill. She wore Maggie's old scarf, a faded blue that matched her eyes, his eyes, and carried herself with a strength he'd come to admire. At 29, she was a woman forged by loss, but not broken. "It does," he agreed, voice low, rough, with the weight of a year's healing. He glanced at the ring, its silver a quiet anchor. She'd love this. Sophie nodded, a small smile tugging her lips. She'd say we're late. She planted these in spring. A laugh escaped her, soft and real, the first he'd heard in months. It warmed him, a sound he'd missed without knowing. They'd spent the year here, piecing together a life from Maggie's shadow. James had moved into the cottage, its creaking floors and salt-worn walls a far cry from Manhattan's polish. Sophie came and went, her apartment in Portland a base for her writing, but she always returned, to check on him, to sit by the fire, to talk about her mother. The letters, Maggie's unsent pleas, had become their bridge, read aloud on long nights, each one a thread stitching them closer. "Sophie's 10 today," one said. "She drew you a picture, a man in a suit. I told her you're busy, but I wish you'd see it." He'd cried then, and Sophie had too, their hands touching over the page. He turned to the sea, the horizon blurring as memory tugged. A year ago, he'd knelt by Maggie's bed, the ring back on her finger, her last smile etched in his soul. Victor's downfall had followed, Sophie's evidence sealing his fate, fraud charges sticking like tar. But it was Maggie's loss that defined him. He'd buried her in this garden, her ashes scattered among the carnations, a promise kept. Sophie had stood beside him, silent, her hand in his as the wind carried her mother away. Now, a new sound broke the quiet, a child's giggle. James turned, spotting a small figure toddling across the lawn. Lily, Sophie's daughter, 2 years old, her curls bouncing as she chased a leaf. Sophie's boyfriend, a quiet carpenter named Tom, trailed behind, grinning. "She's fast," he called, scooping her up as she squealed. "She is," James said, a warmth spreading in his chest. He'd met Lily 6 months ago, when Sophie brought her to the cottage. A surprise that had undone him. "Grandpa," she'd called him once, lisping, and he'd nearly wept. Today, she ran to him, arms outstretched, and he lifted her, weight a joy he'd never earned but cherished. "Read?" she asked, pointing to a book in his coat pocket, a worn copy of Goodnight Moon, Maggie's favorite. He nodded, settling on a bench by the garden, Lily in his lap. Sophie joined them, leaning against the frame with the ring, watching as he opened the pages. "In the great green room," he began, his voice steady, trembling with a tenderness he'd learned late. Lily nestled closer, her tiny hand on his, and he felt Maggie there, her spirit in the child, in the garden, in the life they'd salvaged. He'd started a foundation last spring, Maggie's hope, funding single mothers, a quiet amends for the years he'd left her to struggle. Sophie wrote the story, Waiting for You, a memoir of Maggie's love, and it sat on shelves now, a bestseller that spoke their truth. The money went to the foundation, a legacy not of power, but of care. Victor rotted in prison, his threats, dust, and James found peace in this, honor not in wealth but in the hands he held now. Lily yawned, her eyes drooping, and James closed the book. "Sleepy?" he asked, brushing her hair. She nodded, and he carried her inside, Sophie following. The cottage smelled of cedar and coffee, a pot brewing on the stove, his clumsy attempt at domesticity. He laid Lily in a crib by the fire, breaths evening out, and turned to Sophie. "You're good with her," she said, pouring 2 mugs, handing him one. The steam curled between them, a fragile peace I'm learning, he replied, sipping the bitter brew. "From you, from her." He nodded upstairs where Maggie's memory lingered. Sophie sat across from him, the firelight dancing in her eyes. "I hated you for so long," she said, voice soft. But she didn't. She saw something in you. I see it now, too. He swallowed, tears pricking. "I don't deserve that." "Maybe not," she said, echoing Maggie's words from that stormy night. "But we do." She reached across, her hand finding his, and they sat there, father and daughter, the past a scar but not a chain. Outside, the carnation stood tall, the ring watching over them, a vow unbroken. The sun dipped low, painting the sea gold, and James Carver, a man who'd lost everything to find it again, knew this was his honor, his redemption, not in boardrooms or headlines, but in a garden, a child's laugh, a daughter's trust. Maggie had waited, and he'd come home. "Thank you for walking this road with me," he said, voice thick. "Does it touch your heart, Sophie?" She squeezed his hand, a smile breaking through. "Yeah, Dad, it does."